Racist neighbor insults Elon Musk, then finds out who he really is. The neighborhood had always been quiet, a picturesque suburb with manicured lawns and picket fences. But peace in any setting, as many would say, is a fragile thing. It only takes one sour note to disrupt a harmonious tune. This sour note came in the form of a man named Roger Calloway, the self-proclaimed watchdog of the block. Roger was a stocky man in his mid-50s, with a permanent scowl and a voice that always seemed set at maximum volume. He prided himself on knowing every detail about everyone on his street, where they worked, who came to visit, even what time they watered their lawns. His unwelcome curiosity cloaked itself as concern for maintaining standards in the neighborhood. Roger had no patience for strangers, especially those who didn't fit into his narrow vision of what the neighborhood should look like. When a new resident moved into the house 3 doors down, Roger was already watching before the moving trucks had even parked. The cars unloading belongings seemed high-end but oddly unassuming. No flashy Lamborghinis or ostentatious decor. Puzzled Roger. He had expected either someone desperate for attention or someone entirely unremarkable. A week later, his frustration boiled over. While trimming the hedge that separated his property from the sidewalk, Roger saw the new neighbor step out of a Tesla Model S, casually dressed in a gray t-shirt and jeans. The man was lean, with an air of confidence about him, but otherwise seemed like anyone else. That annoyed Roger. New money, Roger muttered to himself, shaking his head. Thinks he's too good to introduce himself. He had a knack for creating slights where none existed. The new resident seemed preoccupied, barely glancing Roger's way as he walked toward his house. Roger glared after him, muttering something inaudible before heading back inside his home. Stewing. He didn't like being ignored. The first encounter between the two men happened the following weekend. Roger had set up an impromptu neighborhood watch meeting at his front yard, loudly broadcasting his concerns about new elements changing the neighborhood. He didn't mention anyone by name, but the group of neighbors who had gathered caught his drift when he gestured toward the new resident's house, his voice dripping with disdain. "I'm not saying anything outright," Roger declared, his hands on his hips, "but shouldn't we vet people a little more? I mean, who knows what kind of people move in these days? We've got standards to maintain." A woman from down the block raised a tentative hand. "But Roger, he's only been here a week." "What's the issue?" Roger scoffed. "The issue is we know nothing about him. He's cagey. Did you see the way he just ignored me the other day? This street isn't for people who can't respect their neighbors." At that moment, the subject of their gossip stepped out of his house. He walked toward his car, completely ignoring the murmurs and stares from across the street. For Roger, this was the last straw. "Hey!" Roger bellowed, crossing the street without hesitation. "Excuse me, we need to talk." The man stopped mid-step and turned to face Roger, his expression unreadable. "Yes." Roger crossed his arms. "I don't know how things work where you're from, but around here we like to know who we're dealing with. You've been here a week and haven't introduced yourself to a single soul." The man blinked slowly. "I wasn't aware there was a requirement." Roger let out a humorless chuckle. "Oh, it's not about requirements. It's about courtesy. This is a tight-knit community. We like to keep it that way." The man seemed unimpressed. "I see. Well, I appreciate your concern. I've just been busy settling in." Roger wasn't satisfied. "Busy? Too busy for common decency? Maybe you're too busy to live in a neighborhood like this." His tone carried an edge that hinted at something uglier than just irritation. The man tilted his head, his gaze sharpening slightly. "I'm sorry if I've offended you. That wasn't my intention." But Roger wasn't interested in apologies. He was looking for a fight, or at least the satisfaction of putting someone in their place. Intentions don't matter. Actions do. And right now, your actions make it look like you think you're above the rest of us. The man gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Not at all. But I'll keep your advice in mind." Roger stood there, momentarily at a loss for words. He wasn't used to people deflecting him so easily. It irritated him even more. As the man walked back into his house, Roger turned and stomped back toward the gathering of neighbors, grumbling under his breath. For the next few days, Roger's fixation only grew. He noticed every little thing about his new neighbor: the late-night deliveries, the unmarked vans that occasionally pulled up to the house, and the steady stream of visitors who arrived in suits or expensive cars. It didn't take long for Roger's paranoia to morph into outright hostility. He began spreading rumors to anyone who would listen. "It's not normal," he told his friends during their weekly poker night. "He's hiding something. Mark my words. There's something shady going on there." The following morning, Roger decided to take things further. Armed with his smartphone, he stood on the sidewalk across from the house, snapping pictures of every visitor, car, and package that came or went. He even went so far as to approach delivery drivers, grilling them about the contents of their deliveries. Most ignored him, but one gave him a curt, "None of your business," which only fueled Roger's determination. By the end of the week, Roger was no longer content with just watching. He started leaving passive-aggressive notes on his neighbor's mailbox, each one growing nastier. "This isn't the kind of neighborhood for your kind," one read. "We don't want any trouble here," said another. The man never responded. Roger interpreted the silence as weakness. "He's scared," he told his wife over dinner one night. "He knows he doesn't belong here." But Roger's wife, used to her husband's antics, wasn't so sure. "Or maybe he's just ignoring you because you're being ridiculous," she replied, earning a glare that silenced the conversation. The tension reached a boiling point on a sunny Saturday afternoon. The neighborhood was hosting a small block party, complete with food trucks and music. Most of the residents had gathered near the cul-de-sac, enjoying the festivities. Roger, however, had stationed himself near his neighbor's house, waiting for any excuse to confront him. When the man finally stepped outside, Roger wasted no time. "Well, look who finally decided to grace us with his presence," he called out, loud enough for the crowd to hear. The man paused, his expression calm but his eyes narrowing slightly. "Is there something you need?" Roger smirked. "Just thought you'd like to know we're having a block party. You'd know that if you ever bothered to engage with your neighbors." "I appreciate the invitation," the man replied evenly. "But I have other plans." Roger rolled his eyes. "Of course you do. Always too busy for the little people, huh?" The crowd fell silent, sensing the tension. The man looked around, his gaze meeting several pairs of curious eyes. Then he turned back to Roger. "It seems you have a lot of opinions about me," he said. "Perhaps we should discuss them." Roger puffed out his chest. "Anytime, anywhere." The man nodded slowly. "Then let's talk." As the two men stood face to face, the crowd edged closer, eager to see how this confrontation would unfold. Unbeknownst to Roger, his opponent was far more than he seemed, and the truth was about to upend everything Roger thought he knew. Roger was restless that night. He paced the length of his living room, muttering to himself and occasionally glancing out the window at his neighbor's house. The man's calm demeanor during their earlier confrontation had unsettled him. It wasn't the reaction Roger had expected. He was used to people snapping back or apologizing, but this man had neither lashed out nor cowered. It felt like a challenge, and Roger wasn't one to back down. "I'm telling you, Mary, there's something off about him," Roger said as he passed his wife, who was seated on the couch with her laptop. She was half listening, used to Roger's tirades. "The way he looked at me today, like he thought he was better than me," Mary sighed. "Or maybe he just didn't want to make a scene, Roger. Not everyone thrives on drama like you do." Roger ignored her, his gaze fixated on the darkened windows across the street. "I'll find out what he's hiding. People don't just move into neighborhoods like this without a reason. I bet he's laundering money or running some kind of scam." Mary rolled her eyes. "Or maybe he's just a normal guy trying to live his life." "Normal guys don't act like that," Roger snapped. "You'll see." The next morning, Roger was up early, his lawnmower roaring to life before most of the neighborhood was even awake. He made a point of mowing the strip of grass closest to his neighbor's house, hoping to provoke some kind of reaction. But when the man finally emerged around mid-morning, he simply nodded politely at Roger before getting into his car and driving off. Roger clenched his fists. "Smug son of a..." he muttered under his breath. He couldn't stand being ignored. Determined to dig deeper, Roger decided to pay a visit to the local homeowners association office. He knew they kept records of property sales and permits, and he was certain he'd find something suspicious. The receptionist, a cheerful woman named Darlene, greeted him warmly. "What can I do for you today, Roger?" she asked. "I need some information on the new guy who moved into 324 Maple," Roger said, leaning on the counter. Darlene raised an eyebrow. "Why do you need that?" Roger hesitated for a moment before leaning in conspiratorially. "Look, I'm just trying to make sure everything's on the up and up. We've got a good thing going in this neighborhood, and I don't want someone coming in and ruining it." Darlene pursed her lips. "Well, Roger, you know I can't just hand out private information." Roger frowned. "I'm not asking for his social security number, Darlene. I just want to know where he came from, what he does for a living." Darlene shook her head. "Sorry, Roger. That's not information we can share." Roger left the office fuming. He wasn't used to hitting dead ends, and it only fueled his determination to get to the bottom of things. He decided to take matters into his own hands. Later that afternoon, Roger parked his car a block away from his neighbor's house and walked back, carrying a clipboard to make himself look official. He knocked on the door and waited, rehearsing his excuse in his head. When no one answered, he peered through the front window, but the curtains were drawn. He tried the side windows with the same result. "Cagey," Roger muttered. "Definitely hiding something." He was about to leave when he noticed a small delivery van pulling up to the driveway. The driver, a young man in his early 20s, stepped out with a package. Roger intercepted him before he reached the door. "Hey there," Roger said, flashing what he thought was a friendly smile. "You delivering to this house?" The driver nodded, clearly wary. "Yeah. Why?" "I'm the neighborhood watch coordinator," Roger lied, holding up his clipboard. "Just making sure everything's safe around here." "Can I ask what's in the package?" The driver frowned. No, that's not how this works." Roger's smile faltered. "Look, I'm just trying to keep an eye out for anything suspicious. If you're not doing anything wrong, you shouldn't mind telling me." The driver sighed. "It's none of your business, man." He pushed past Roger and left the package on the doorstep before getting back into his van and driving off. Roger glared after him, his frustration mounting. He picked up the package and examined it, hoping to find some clue, but it was just a plain cardboard box with no markings other than the shipping label. He set it back down reluctantly and returned home, his mind racing. Over the next few days, Roger's obsession deepened. He began keeping a notebook where he documented every movement at his neighbor's house. He recorded the times the man came and went, the license plates of his visitors, and even the color of the packages delivered. It became an all-consuming project, and Mary grew increasingly annoyed. "Roger, this isn't normal," she said one evening as he scribbled furiously in his notebook. "You're acting like a stalker." "I'm protecting this neighborhood," Roger shot back. "Someone has to." Mary shook her head. "From what? The guy hasn't done anything wrong. You're the only one causing problems." But Roger couldn't be dissuaded. He was convinced that his neighbor was up to something, and he was determined to prove it. One evening, as the sun was setting, Roger saw his neighbor standing in his driveway, talking to a man in a suit. The two seemed to be having an intense conversation, and Roger couldn't resist the urge to eavesdrop. He crept closer, hiding behind a row of bushes. "I don't care how much it costs," he heard his neighbor say. "Just make it happen." Roger's eyes widened. He had no idea what they were talking about, but it sounded important. He pulled out his phone and started recording, hoping to catch something incriminating. But before he could get closer, the man in the suit spotted him. "Can I help you?" the man called out, his tone sharp. Roger froze, his heart racing. His neighbor turned to look at him, his expression unreadable. "I was just, checking the bushes," Roger stammered. They looked overgrown. The man in the suit raised an eyebrow. "Right?" Roger backed away, feeling both embarrassed and angry. He returned to his house, vowing to find a way to expose his neighbor. As he sat in his living room that night, Replaying the recording on his phone, Roger felt a surge of determination. He didn't know what his neighbor was up to, but he was going to find out, even if it meant crossing a few lines. Roger's obsession began to reach a fever pitch. Every spare moment was consumed by his mission to unmask his neighbor, who remained maddeningly calm and elusive. It wasn't just about the perceived slight anymore. It had turned into a personal vendetta. Roger needed to prove he was right about the man. There was something deeply unsettling about how effortlessly he sidestepped confrontation, and Roger was certain it was because he had something to hide. The following morning, Roger decided it was time to up the ante. He waited by his window, pretending to drink coffee, as he watched his neighbor prepare to leave the house. The man, dressed casually in a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, gave a polite wave to a passing dog walker as he got into his car. Roger's eyes narrowed. This was his chance. He threw on his jacket, grabbed his car keys, and darted out the door. He kept a safe distance as he followed his neighbor's Tesla down the suburban streets. It wasn't difficult. The sleek, futuristic car stood out among the older sedans and minivans that populated their quiet neighborhood. Roger's hands gripped the wheel tightly as he kept his eyes fixed on the car ahead. The Tesla eventually pulled into a local hardware store. Roger parked a few spaces away and watched as his neighbor got out and walked inside. Taking a deep breath, Roger followed. His plan was to casually bump into the man, maybe get him talking, and see if he could catch any slip-ups. As Roger walked through the aisles, he spotted his neighbor inspecting a shelf of light bulbs. "Hey there," Roger said, his tone forced and overly cheerful. The man turned, his face lighting up with polite recognition. "Oh, hello. Roger, right?" Roger nodded, slightly annoyed that the man remembered his name. "Yeah, that's me. Doing some home improvement. Just replacing a few bulbs," the man said, holding up a box. "How about you?" Roger glanced around, scrambling for an excuse. Just browsing. Thinking about some projects." The man nodded amicably. "Well, if you need any recommendations, the staff here is great." Roger gritted his teeth. There it was again, that calm, unflappable demeanor. It was infuriating. He decided to push further. "So, you've been in the neighborhood for a little while now," Roger said, trying to sound casual. "What brought you here?" The man hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Oh, I just needed a change of scenery. It's a nice area, isn't it?" "Sure is," Roger replied, his tone laced with suspicion. "But, what do you do for work? I don't think I've seen you leave for a job." The man's smile didn't waver. "I work from home most of the time. It's convenient." Roger raised an eyebrow. "Must be nice. What kind of work?" The man glanced at his watch. "Well, I should probably get going. Nice chatting with you, Roger." And just like that, he walked away, leaving Roger standing there, seething. It was like talking to a wall. The man gave away nothing, and it only made Roger more determined. Later that day, Roger decided to take a different approach. He went online and started searching for property records, hoping to find some clue about his neighbor's background. After an hour of digging, he found the deed to the house. It was listed under the name E. Arb Johnson. The name meant nothing to Roger, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was an alias. He jotted it down in his notebook and continued searching. Hours passed, and Roger's frustration grew. He found nothing. No social media accounts, no news articles, no business listings, just a few generic results that didn't seem to match his neighbor. It was like the man didn't exist. Roger slammed his laptop shut and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The next day, Roger's determination only grew stronger. He decided to test his neighbor in a more direct way. As the man returned home from a morning jog, Roger stepped outside and approached him. "Hey, got a minute?" Roger called out. The man paused, slightly out of breath but smiling as always. "Sure, what's up?" Roger gestured toward the hedge that separated their yards. "I noticed some branches from your side hanging over into my property. I was wondering if you could trim them back." "Of course," the man said without hesitation. "I'll take care of it this weekend." Roger blinked, caught off guard by the easy agreement. He had expected at least a little pushback. Okay. Thanks. No problem, the man said, nodding before heading inside. Roger stood there for a moment, unsure of how to react. Every attempt to provoke the man seemed to bounce off him like water off a duck's back. It was maddening. He needed to dig deeper. That evening, Roger called up a friend of his, a retired police officer named Jack. The two hadn't spoken in years, but Roger was desperate. "Jack, I need a favor," Roger said after a brief exchange of pleasantries. "What kind of favor?" Jack asked, his tone wary. "I need you to run a background check on someone," Roger said, lowering his voice as if someone might overhear. Jack sighed. "Roger, I can't do that. It's not exactly legal." "Come on, Jack. This guy is shady. He's hiding something. I just know it." "Maybe he's just a private person," Jack suggested. "Or maybe he's a criminal," Roger shot back. "Just run the name for me, please." Jack hesitated. "What's the name?" "E.R. Johnson," Roger said. Jack chuckled. "That sounds fake." "Exactly," Roger exclaimed. "That's why I need you to look into it." Jack sighed again. "I'll see what I can do, but no promises." Roger hung up, feeling a mix of relief and anticipation. He was finally making progress. One way or another, he was going to uncover the truth about his neighbor. It wasn't just about curiosity anymore, it was about principle. Roger was convinced that the man's calm exterior was a facade, and he was determined to tear it down. Roger's anticipation had only grown since his conversation with Jack. For the first time, he felt like he had an actual lead. A name, albeit one that sounded fabricated, but it was something. He paced back and forth in his living room, anxiously waiting for Jack's call. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that E.R. Johnson was some kind of alias. Who was this man, really? And why was he hiding? Hours passed, and Roger's impatience got the better of him. He decided to take matters into his own hands. His neighbor's calm, composed demeanor grated on him to no end. There was something about that unflappable politeness that felt like a challenge, like the man was taunting Roger without saying a word. Roger needed to provoke a reaction. That would expose the truth, he was sure of it. Later that afternoon, Roger saw his neighbor in the front yard, kneeling down to fix a loose sprinkler head. It was the perfect opportunity. Roger grabbed his rake, pretending to tend to some leaves near the property line, and walked over. "Hey, Johnson," Roger said, deliberately using the name he'd found. The man looked up, slightly puzzled. "Johnson?" "Yeah," Roger said, leaning on the rake. "That's what it says on the property records, right? E.R. Johnson." The man's expression didn't change. He smiled lightly and stood up, brushing dirt off his hands. "That's correct. Is there something I can help you with?" Roger's jaw clenched. He had expected some kind of reaction. A flinch, a hesitation, anything. But the man remained as calm as ever. It only fueled Roger's frustration. "Just curious," Roger said, feigning nonchalance. "You don't seem like a Johnson." The man chuckled. "Well, names can be deceiving, I suppose." Roger frowned. People around here like to get to know their neighbors. It's a pretty tight-knit community. "I've noticed," the man said with a nod. "It's one of the reasons I moved here." Roger's grip tightened on the rake. "And yet, you don't really talk about yourself much, do you?" The man tilted his head, as if considering the question. "I suppose I prefer to listen rather than talk." "That's convenient," Roger said, his tone sharp. The man didn't take the bait. Instead, he glanced at his watch. "I'd love to chat more, Roger, but I've got some work to do. Let me know if you need anything." Leaving Roger standing there, fuming. It was like trying to punch a cloud. No matter what Roger did, the man just absorbed it and floated away. But Roger wasn't done. Not by a long shot. That evening, Roger decided to take his snooping to the next level. He knew the man had a Tesla, one of those fancy electric cars with all the bells and whistles. Roger had read somewhere that Teslas had unique registration numbers, and he figured if he could get a look at the license plate, he might be able to dig up more information. Under the cover of darkness, Roger crept out of his house and onto the street. The Tesla was parked in the driveway, its sleek, silver body gleaming under the streetlights. Roger felt a surge of adrenaline as he approached, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. He crouched down behind the car, fumbling with his phone to take a picture of the license plate. "Late night walk?" a voice said suddenly. Roger froze, his heart pounding. He looked up to see his neighbor standing on the front porch, arms crossed, a faint smile on his face. Roger scrambled to his feet, trying to play it cool. Yeah, Roger stammered. "Just getting some fresh air." The man raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. "Well, it's a beautiful night for it. Enjoy." Roger mumbled something unintelligible and hurried back to his house, his face burning with embarrassment. How had the man caught him so easily? And why hadn't he said anything? It was infuriating. The next day, Roger couldn't shake the feeling that his neighbor was onto him. Every time he saw the man outside, tending to his garden or walking to the mailbox, Roger felt a surge of paranoia. Was the man watching him too, or was he just imagining it? Determined to regain the upper hand, Roger decided to rally the neighborhood against his enigmatic neighbor. He went door to door, talking to anyone who would listen. "Have you ever noticed anything strange about the guy who lives next to me?" Roger asked, leaning in conspiratorially. Most people shrugged or shook their heads. "He seems nice enough," one woman said. "Keeps to himself, but he's polite." "Polite," Roger muttered under his breath. "That's what he wants you to think." "What are you getting at, Roger?" another neighbor asked, frowning. "Are you saying he's dangerous?" "I'm saying we don't know anything about him," Roger said, his voice rising. "And that's not normal. People around here have nothing to hide. Why does he?" Some neighbors nodded, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Roger felt a small sense of triumph. At least a few of them were starting to see his point. He encouraged them to keep an eye on the man, to report anything suspicious. It was only a matter of time, Roger thought, before the truth came out. But as the days went on, Roger's obsession began to take a toll. He spent hours glued to his laptop, scouring the internet for any trace of E.R. Johnson. He neglected his yard, his chores, even his sleep. His wife, tired of his antics, had started avoiding him altogether. "You're letting this guy live rent-free in your head," she said one night, crossing her arms. "Why do you care so much?" "Because it's not right," Roger snapped. "People don't just move to a neighborhood like this and keep secrets. He's hiding something, and I'm gonna find out what. Or maybe he's just a private person," she shot back. "Not everyone wants to broadcast their life story." Roger ignored her, his eyes fixed on the screen. He was too far in now to back down. He had to prove he was right, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, his neighbor continued to go about his life as if nothing had happened. He waved politely when he saw Roger, exchanged pleasantries with other neighbors, and went about his business. It was maddening. How could someone be so calm, so unbothered? Roger's frustration reached a boiling point one afternoon when he saw his neighbor chatting with a delivery driver in the driveway. The two of them laughed about something, and Roger felt a surge of irrational anger. He grabbed his phone and took a picture from his window, determined to document every interaction, every detail. But as he zoomed in on the photo, something caught his eye. The delivery driver's clipboard had a label on it, something about a high-priority delivery. Roger squinted, trying to make out the words. His mind raced. What kind of high-priority delivery would someone like his neighbor need? It only added to the mystery. Roger was more determined than ever. Whatever this man was hiding, Roger was going to expose it. And when he did, the entire neighborhood would see that Roger had been right all along. Roger's frustration had now morphed into a full-blown obsession, and it was beginning to show. The blinds in his living room were perpetually half-closed, allowing him to peek out at his neighbor's house at all times without being seen. His yard, once pristine, was littered with neglected tools and patches of uncut grass, a stark contrast to his neighbor's immaculately maintained property. The irony wasn't lost on the neighborhood gossipers. Roger, the self-proclaimed gatekeeper of suburban order, had become the one out of place. But Roger didn't care. He was convinced he was on the verge of a breakthrough. He just needed one more piece of evidence to confirm his suspicions. It was late afternoon when Roger noticed a sleek black SUV pull up to his neighbor's house. The vehicle looked official. Tinted windows, government plates, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase. Roger's heart raced. This was it. Proof that his neighbor wasn't just some mild-mannered recluse. This was the sign of something bigger. Grabbing his phone, Roger hurried outside under the pretense of watering his plants. He positioned himself behind a bush near the property line, his phone camera trained on the front yard. The suited man knocked on the door, and the neighbor answered, shaking hands with the visitor. Their conversation was too far away for Roger to hear, but he caught glimpses of their body language, calm, professional, yet somehow weighty. Then came the moment that set Roger's paranoia into overdrive. The man handed over the briefcase, and the neighbor opened it slightly, just enough for a peek inside. Roger couldn't make out the contents, but he swore he saw something metallic glint in the sunlight before the case was snapped shut. The two men exchanged a few more words, and the visitor left as quickly as he had arrived. Roger ducked behind the bush, panting with adrenaline. What had he just witnessed? A government handoff? A bribe? He needed answers. But he also knew that barging over to confront his neighbor wouldn't get him anywhere. The man was a master of deflection, always calm and composed. No, this called for a more strategic approach. That night, Roger took to the neighborhood's private Facebook group. Under the guise of fostering community awareness, he posted a vague warning about suspicious activity in the area. Neighbors, be on the lookout for unfamiliar vehicles or individuals. We've worked hard to maintain a safe and welcoming community, and it's important to stay vigilant. The post quickly garnered comments, some expressing concern, others asking for more details. Roger responded selectively, careful not to implicate himself too directly. Let's just say some new residents aren't as transparent as they should be, he wrote, his words dripping with insinuation. The post had the desired effect. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with speculation. Roger overheard snippets of conversations during his morning walk. Words like outsider, suspicious, and doesn't fit in floated through the air. A small, petty part of him relished the way his narrative was spreading. But his satisfaction was short-lived. When he returned home, he found his wife waiting for him, arms crossed and a look of exasperation on her face. "What are you doing, Roger?" she demanded. "What do you mean?" he replied, feigning ignorance. "You know exactly what I mean," she said, holding up her phone. "This post you made? Stirring everyone up against the neighbor? It's embarrassing." "It's not embarrassing," Roger shot back. "It's necessary. People need to know what's going on." "Do they?" she countered. "Or is this just about you and your ego? You don't like him because he doesn't fit into your little idea of what a neighbor should be." Roger's face turned red. "This isn't about me. It's about protecting our community." "From what?" she asked, her voice rising. "A guy who keeps to himself and waters his plants? You're turning this into some ridiculous crusade, and you're dragging the whole neighborhood into it." Roger opened his mouth to argue but couldn't find the words. Instead, he stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. He needed to clear his head, and more importantly, he needed to refocus. His wife's disapproval was a distraction, but it wouldn't deter him. Determined to dig deeper, Roger decided to search for the SUV that had visited his neighbor. He remembered the partial license plate he had seen and spent hours online, using public records and forums to track it down. His persistence eventually paid off. The SUV was registered to a company that specialized in secure transportation for high-profile clients. Roger's mind reeled. High-profile clients? Could his neighbor be one of them? The pieces were starting to come together, but they only raised more questions. Why would someone with access to such services choose to live in their modest neighborhood? What was he hiding? Roger was more convinced than ever that his neighbor's calm demeanor was a facade, a carefully constructed act to deflect suspicion. But Roger's digging hadn't gone unnoticed. The next day, he received an unexpected visitor, a middle-aged woman who lived 2 doors down. She was one of the more influential voices in the neighborhood, known for organizing block parties and mediating disputes. "Roger," she said, her tone friendly but firm. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course," he replied, forcing a smile. She stepped inside and glanced around, noting the clutter and general disarray. "I've been hearing some concerns from the neighbors about your, interest in Mr. Johnson." Roger bristled. "Concerns? I'm just trying to look out for everyone." "I understand that," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But some people feel like it's becoming a bit intrusive." "Intrusive?" Roger repeated, incredulous. "I'm doing what no one else has the guts to do. That man is hiding something. Or," she said gently, "he's just a private person who doesn't want his life dissected by his neighbors. Have you considered that?" Roger's temper flared. "I don't need a lecture, okay? I know what I'm doing." The woman sighed. "Roger, we all value your commitment to the neighborhood, but maybe it's time to take a step back. Focus on your own life for a while." With that, she left, leaving Roger stewing in his indignation. Take a step back? Focus on his own life? The nerve of her. Didn't they realize he was doing this for them, for the community? But as the days wore on, Roger couldn't shake the feeling that the tide was turning against him. The neighbors he had rallied were starting to distance themselves, unwilling to get involved in his increasingly erratic crusade. Even Jack, his closest ally, seemed less enthusiastic. "Maybe she's right," Jack said one afternoon. "Maybe we should let it go." "Let it go?" Roger snapped. "We're this close to the truth, and you want to quit?" Jack shrugged. "I don't know, Roger. It just feels messy." Roger stared at him, disbelief etched across his face. Was he really the only one who saw what was happening? The only one willing to stand up for what was right? As he watched Jack walk away, Roger felt a deep sense of isolation. But he also felt something else, a renewed determination. If no one else would help him, he'd do it alone. He was going to expose his neighbor, no matter the cost. Roger's sense of isolation fueled a determination that had him spiraling deeper into his obsession. If no one else in the neighborhood could see what was so blatantly clear to him, he would take matters into his own hands. The idea of being the lone soldier in a battle for the community's safety gave him a twisted sense of purpose, though his wife's increasing distance and Jack's lack of support weighed heavily on his mind. That night, as the house lay silent, Roger sat in his dimly lit study, poring over printed records and maps of the neighborhood. He was convinced there had to be a pattern. Why would a man of means and connections, evidenced by the mysterious visitor with the briefcase and SUV, live in such an unassuming neighborhood? He circled dates on his calendar, noting the comings and goings of cars and visitors to his neighbor's house. To anyone else, this was the harmless behavior of a man with an active social circle. To Roger, it was a suspicious anomaly. The next morning, Roger had a plan. He would stage an accidental encounter to force a conversation with his enigmatic neighbor. He grabbed his toolbox and headed to the driveway under the pretense of fixing a loose gutter. From his vantage point, he could see his neighbor watering the neatly trimmed hedges in his front yard. Roger watched for a few moments, his hands twitching with nerves, before deliberately knocking over his stepladder, creating a loud clatter. His neighbor looked up from his work and called out, "Everything okay over there?" Roger played the part, waving sheepishly. "Yeah, just a bit clumsy this morning." "Say, do you have a moment? Could use a second opinion on this gutter." The neighbor hesitated for a split second before setting down his watering can. He strolled over, his expression friendly yet unreadable. "What's the issue?" Roger launched into an overly detailed explanation about the angle of the gutter and water flow, but his real focus was on studying the man's demeanor. He searched for cracks in the calm exterior, for signs of defensiveness or deception, but his neighbor remained composed, nodding politely as Roger rambled. "Thanks for taking a look," Roger said, feigning gratitude. "You've been a bit of a mystery around here. I guess I'm just curious. What brought you to our quiet little neighborhood?" The neighbor smiled faintly. "I like the peace and quiet. It's a nice change of pace." "Change of pace from what?" Roger pressed, his tone light but probing. The neighbor's smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Amusement, perhaps? "From a busy life, I suppose," Roger didn't miss a beat. "You must have had an interesting career. People like you don't end up in places like this by accident."
The neighbor chuckled, deflecting. "I've had my share of interesting experiences, but I'm enjoying retirement now." The word retirement didn't sit well with Roger. It was vague, a convenient way to avoid specifics. He wanted to push further, but his neighbor glanced at his watch and said, "Well, I should get back to it. Let me know if you need anything else." Roger nodded, plastering on a polite smile as his neighbor walked away. Once out of sight, Roger's frustration boiled over. He felt as though he had been politely dismissed, his attempts to glean information thwarted by the man's unflappable demeanor. Later that day, Roger's frustration turned to outright anger when he noticed a delivery truck pull up to his neighbor's house. The driver unloaded several large boxes, which were carried inside without so much as a label visible. Roger's mind raced with possibilities. What could be in those boxes? Equipment? Documents? Something illegal? Unable to contain himself, Roger decided he needed to see for himself. That night, under the cover of darkness, he crept to the side of his neighbor's house, sticking close to the shadows. His heart pounded as he reached the window nearest the living room. Peeking inside, he saw the neighbor sitting at a desk, typing on a laptop. One of the boxes sat open beside him, its contents obscured by the angle. Roger strained to see more, pressing his face closer to the glass. Suddenly, a sound from behind him made Roger freeze. It was a deep growl. Turning slowly, he found himself face to face with a large German shepherd, its teeth bared in a warning snarl. Roger's breath caught in his throat as the dog barked sharply, alerting the entire neighborhood to his presence. The light inside the house turned on, and his neighbor stepped onto the porch, looking around. "Who's out there?" Roger bolted, sprinting back to his own yard with the dog barking furiously behind him. He tripped over his own sprinkler and landed hard on his side, scraping his arm. His neighbor didn't pursue him but stood on the porch, his silhouette illuminated by the light. The next morning, Roger awoke to find a note slipped under his door. The message was brief and unsettling. "We should talk." Roger's paranoia went into overdrive. Had his neighbor recognized him? Was this a warning? He spent the day pacing his house, his wife growing increasingly exasperated with his erratic behavior. "You're going to give yourself a heart attack," she snapped. "Why don't you just talk to him like an adult?" But Roger couldn't bring himself to face his neighbor. Instead, he doubled down on his surveillance, hoping to catch something, anything, that would justify his actions. He installed a new set of cameras on the edge of his property, angling them toward his neighbor's yard. He spent hours combing through footage, looking for patterns or anomalies. Days turned into weeks, and Roger's obsession consumed him entirely. He began skipping work, letting his responsibilities fall by the wayside. His friends stopped calling, and even Jack stopped dropping by. Roger didn't care. He was convinced he was on the verge of uncovering something big, something that would vindicate him in the eyes of the community. But as he stared at his monitor, his eyes bloodshot and his mind racing, a thought crept into his consciousness, unbidden and unwelcome. What if he was wrong? What if his neighbor really was just a quiet man trying to live his life? The possibility gnawed at him, but he quickly pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to doubt himself, not now, not when he was so close. Roger didn't realize just how much his obsession had cost him until his wife packed his suitcase and left. "I can't do this anymore," she said, tears in her eyes. "You're not the man I married. You're not even trying to be." Her departure left Roger feeling hollow, but even that wasn't enough to deter him. He was too far gone, too deep in his own narrative to turn back now. As the days dragged on, Roger's world shrank to the confines of his house, his yard, and the ever-watchful gaze he kept trained on his neighbor. Unbeknownst to Roger, his actions hadn't gone unnoticed. His neighbor had been watching him too, and he was finally ready to make his move. Roger's obsession began to manifest in ways he couldn't control. His days bled into nights, spent watching the camera feeds and documenting every move his neighbor made. He convinced himself that the man's calm demeanor was a carefully crafted facade, hiding something sinister. Roger started logging every vehicle that entered the driveway, every light that turned on at odd hours, every unfamiliar face that visited the house. He even kept track of the recycling bins, certain that something in the discarded items might offer him a clue. But Roger wasn't as stealthy as he thought. His neighbor was not oblivious to the cameras, nor to Roger's frequent trips to the edge of his property to adjust them. He noticed the late-night pacing through the living room window, the shadows of Roger's figure darting past the curtains. If the neighbor was annoyed, he didn't show it. Instead, his response was unnervingly nonchalant. One afternoon, Roger sat in his study, scribbling notes about a package delivered earlier that day, a small, square box that his neighbor had taken inside with an unusually cautious air. Roger couldn't shake the feeling that the package was significant. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his concentration. It was a text from Jack. "Jack, you've gone too far, man. Everyone's talking about it. Just let it go before it gets worse." Roger gritted his teeth, his fingers tightening around the phone. Everyone didn't know what he knew. They weren't watching the way he was. He shoved the phone aside and focused back on his notes, ignoring the gnawing unease Jack's message stirred in him. Later that evening, Roger noticed something unusual. A car, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows, pulled into the driveway. The driver didn't get out but sat idling for a moment before the neighbor appeared at the door. Roger watched intently as the man walked out to the car with the same small package from earlier in hand. The two exchanged words, though Roger couldn't make out what was being said. Then the neighbor handed over the package, and the car drove off. Roger felt his heart race. This was it. He was certain he had just witnessed something illegal. He grabbed his phone and took a grainy video of the interaction, convinced it was the breakthrough he needed. But even as he hit record, doubt crept in. What was in the package? Could he really prove anything? Still, Roger wasn't about to let this opportunity slip through his fingers. The next morning, he decided to confront the neighbor directly, under the guise of a casual chat. He rehearsed his approach, carefully crafting his words to seem harmless, even friendly, while digging for information. As Roger approached the neighbor's yard, he noticed the man tending to a rose bush near the driveway. He wore a serene expression, as though completely unaware of the storm Roger was about to bring to his doorstep. Roger cleared his throat loudly to announce his presence. "Morning," Roger said, forcing a smile. The neighbor looked up, his face breaking into an easy grin. "Good morning, Roger. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Roger nodded stiffly. "Sure is. Mind if I ask you something?" "Of course," the neighbor said, setting down his gardening shears. "What's on your mind?"
Roger hesitated, his carefully rehearsed lines slipping away under the weight of the man's calm gaze. I couldn't help but notice you had a visitor yesterday. Black sedan? Looked official." The neighbor's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Oh, that, just a business acquaintance. Nothing too exciting. Business, huh?" Roger pressed, trying to sound casual. "Didn't know you were still working. Just a bit here and there," the neighbor replied, his tone light. "Keeps me busy." Roger's frustration grew. The man was giving him nothing, no hint of guilt or nervousness. He decided to push harder. "You know, it's funny. A guy like you, with your resources, keeping such a low profile, makes people curious." The neighbor tilted his head, his smile thinning just slightly. "Curiosity is a double-edged sword, Roger. Sometimes it leads to answers, and sometimes it leads to trouble." Roger felt a chill run down his spine at the subtle warning in the man's words, but he refused to back down. "I'm just saying, people around here like to know who they're living next to. Keeps the neighborhood safe." The neighbor studied Roger for a moment before nodding slowly. "You're right, Roger. A safe neighborhood is important. But trust me, I'm the least of your concerns." The cryptic response sent Roger into a tailspin. He returned to his house, his mind racing with possibilities. What did the neighbor mean by least of your concerns? Was it a threat? A clue? Roger spent the rest of the day combing through his notes, cross-referencing license plates and delivery times. He was determined to prove that his instincts were right. That evening, as Roger sat at his desk, a knock at the door startled him. He froze, his heart pounding. Who could it be at this hour? Slowly, he made his way to the door and peered through the peephole. To his shock, it was his neighbor, standing on the porch with a calm but unreadable expression. Roger hesitated before opening the door a crack. "Can I help you?" The neighbor's smile was polite but strained. "I thought we should have that talk." Roger's stomach dropped. He stepped aside reluctantly, allowing the man to enter. The neighbor looked around the cluttered living room, his gaze lingering on the stacks of papers and camera equipment scattered across the space. "You've been busy," the neighbor said, his tone neutral. Roger bristled. "What do you want?" The neighbor met his eyes, his expression unreadable. "To clear the air. It seems you've been paying me quite a bit of attention." Roger's defenses went up. "I don't know what you're talking about." The neighbor chuckled softly. "Come on, Roger. Let's not insult each other's intelligence. I've seen the cameras, the late-night prowling. You're a man on a mission. The question is, what mission?" Roger felt the walls closing in, his carefully constructed narrative beginning to crumble. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time, he realized he was in over his head. Roger's nerves were fraying as the days stretched on. The cryptic conversation with his neighbor played on a loop in his mind. Every word, every glance, every pause seemed laden with hidden meaning. He told himself he was close to figuring it all out, that his diligence was about to pay off. But deep down, doubt was creeping in. What if Jack had been right? What if this whole thing was just a product of his imagination spiraling out of control? Despite the creeping uncertainty, Roger doubled down on his efforts. He spent the night rewiring the cameras on the edge of his property to get a better angle on his neighbor's driveway. He calibrated the zoom feature and even installed an additional microphone, hoping to catch any stray bits of conversation. By the time he finished, dawn was breaking, but Roger didn't rest. He brewed another pot of coffee and planted himself in front of the monitor, determined to stay vigilant. By mid-morning, Roger noticed a delivery van pulling into the neighbor's driveway. The driver stepped out, carrying a small wooden crate. Roger zoomed in on the scene, heart pounding. His neighbor emerged from the house and exchanged a few words with the deliverman, who handed him a clipboard to sign. Roger leaned in closer, trying to read the label on the crate, but the angle made it impossible. "What are you hiding now?" Roger muttered under his breath. After the deliverman left, the neighbor carried the crate inside with ease. Roger's frustration grew. He needed to know what was inside, but he couldn't risk getting too close without being noticed. He decided to wait, hoping that the crate would reappear or that his neighbor would inadvertently give something away. Hours passed, and Roger's patience began to wane. The neighbor seemed to go about his day as usual, watering plants, checking the mail, and even taking a brief jog around the neighborhood. Nothing about his behavior seemed out of the ordinary, but that only made Roger more suspicious. He was convinced the man was deliberately acting normal to throw him off. That afternoon, Roger's phone buzzed with a text from Jack. "Jack, you need to stop, dude. You're making everyone uncomfortable. Do you even hear yourself when you talk about this guy?" Roger clenched his jaw and typed back a terse reply. "Roger, I know what I'm doing. You'll see." Jack didn't respond, and Roger took that as a small victory. He returned his focus to the monitor just in time to see his neighbor walking toward the garage with a toolbox in hand. Roger's interest peaked. The man opened the garage door, revealing a sleek car covered in a tarp. It was the first time Roger had seen inside the garage, and he felt a surge of triumph. The neighbor had been keeping secrets after all. But as Roger watched, he began to second-guess his assumptions. The neighbor seemed genuinely absorbed in tinkering with the car, his movements methodical and unhurried. There was no sense of urgency or concealment. If he was hiding something, he was doing an excellent job of making it look mundane. Still, Roger wasn't about to let this go. He decided to escalate his efforts. That night, under the cover of darkness, he ventured out to the edge of his property, equipped with a long-range lens and a notepad. He crept closer to the garage, staying low to avoid detection. The garage door was closed now, but the faint glow of a light seeped through the windows. Roger trained his lens on the window, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. His hands shook with adrenaline as he adjusted the focus. For a brief moment, he thought he saw the neighbor holding something metallic, but the angle made it impossible to be sure. Then, without warning, the light inside the garage flicked off. Roger froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Had the neighbor spotted him? He crouched lower, holding his breath. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. Finally, Roger retreated to his house. His nerves frayed, but his determination unshaken. The next morning, Roger decided to confront his neighbor again. This time, he planned to be more direct. He rehearsed his lines in the mirror, determined to come across as confident and in control. He wanted answers, and he wasn't going to let the neighbor's calm demeanor intimidate him. When Roger knocked on the door, it took a moment before the neighbor answered. He looked slightly surprised to see Roger, but greeted him warmly nonetheless. "Morning, Roger," the neighbor said. "What brings you by?" Roger wasted no time. "I need to know what's going on in your garage." The neighbor raised an eyebrow. "My garage?" "Yes," Roger said, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "I've seen the car, the deliveries, the late nights. You're up to something, and I think the neighborhood deserves to know what it is." The neighbor studied Roger for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Roger's surprise, he chuckled softly. "You've got quite the imagination, Roger," he said. "But I assure you, there's nothing sinister happening in my garage." "Then prove it," Roger challenged. "Let me see for myself." The neighbor's smile faded slightly, and for the first time, Roger thought he saw a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. But the man didn't lose his composure. "I don't think that's necessary," the neighbor said. "But if it puts your mind at ease, I'll tell you exactly what's in the garage. It's a project car, something I've been working on in my spare time. Nothing more, nothing less." Roger wasn't satisfied. "Why all the secrecy then? The packages, the late-night work. None of it adds up." The neighbor sighed, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Roger, sometimes people just like to have hobbies. Not everything is a conspiracy." But Roger wasn't convinced. As he left the neighbor's house, his mind raced with possibilities. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man was hiding something, and he was determined to find out what it was. Roger's fixation had reached a fever pitch. The neighbor's dismissive response only deepened his resolve to uncover the truth. Each moment spent in his modest kitchen, staring at the neighbor's house through binoculars, felt like a game of cat and mouse. To Roger, this was no longer just about curiosity. It was a battle of wits, a test of who could outlast the other. He was determined to win. Later that morning, a truck pulled up outside the neighbor's house. It was larger than the typical delivery vans Roger had noted in his journal. Its bulky frame and the logo of a tech distribution company were enough to stir Roger into action. He threw on his jacket, grabbed his notepad, and hurried out into his backyard to get a closer look. Peeking over the fence, he saw the driver struggling to unload a sizable crate from the back of the truck. The neighbor appeared, clipboard in hand, signing off on the delivery with an air of calm that infuriated Roger. The crate was stamped with the words, "Fragile, handle with care," and a serial number Roger couldn't decipher. The exchange was mundane, too mundane for Roger's liking. The neighbor stood there, smiling, chatting briefly with the delivery driver before wheeling the crate into the garage. Roger tried to make sense of it all. Was it more car parts? Electronics? Something illicit? His mind raced, conjuring increasingly elaborate scenarios. "Typical," he muttered under his breath. "He's good at playing innocent." As the truck pulled away, Roger moved quickly. He wanted to get a closer look at the crate before it disappeared inside. Glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one was watching, he crept around the side of his house and onto the sidewalk. The neighbor had his back turned, busy positioning the crate with a dolly. Roger took the opportunity to snap a few photos with his phone. "What are you doing, Roger?" The voice startled him so badly that he nearly dropped his phone. He turned to see Jack standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed and an expression of exasperation plastered across his face. "I could ask you the same thing," Roger shot back, trying to mask his embarrassment with indignation. "Spying on your neighbor again?" Jack asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "This is getting ridiculous." Roger bristled. You wouldn't understand. He's hiding something. Jack rolled his eyes. Or maybe he's just living his life, and you're projecting all your paranoia onto him. You saw the crate, Roger insisted. Doesn't that strike you as odd? Who needs deliveries like that in a quiet neighborhood like this? People order all kinds of things these days, Jack said. Maybe he's into DIY. Ever think of that? But Roger wasn't about to be swayed. He gestured toward the house with a dramatic flourish. Mark my words, Jack. There's more to this guy than meets the eye. And I'm going to prove it. Jack threw up his hands in defeat. Fine, do whatever you want. But don't come crying to me when this blows up in your face. With that, Jack walked off, leaving Roger standing there, seething. He hated being doubted, especially by someone as complacent as Jack. This was his mission now, and he wasn't going to let anyone derail it. The rest of the day was spent analyzing the photos he'd taken. Roger scrutinized every detail of the crate, zooming in on the label and running searches on the serial number. But the results were inconclusive. Frustrated, he decided to take a bolder approach. That evening, as the neighborhood settled into its usual calm, Roger ventured out once again. Armed with gloves, a flashlight, and a crowbar tucked into his jacket, he crept toward the neighbor's garage. He'd convinced himself this was the only way to get answers. If the man was hiding something, Roger was going to find it. The garage door was closed, but a small side window offered a potential entry point. Roger positioned himself beneath it, his heart pounding in his chest as he scanned the surroundings for any sign of movement. The street was quiet, the houses dark. He was sure no one was watching. With a swift motion, he slipped the crowbar beneath the window pane and pried it open just enough to slide his hand through. His fingers fumbled for the latch, finally finding it and clicking it open. Carefully, he hoisted himself through the window and dropped to the floor inside. The garage was dimly lit, and the smell of oil and metal filled the air. The crate sat in the corner, partially covered with a tarp. Roger approached it, his pulse racing. He grabbed the crowbar and wedged it beneath the lid, applying pressure until the nails squeaked and gave way. He lifted the lid slowly, half expecting some dramatic reveal. But the contents were underwhelming, at least at first glance. The crate was filled with what appeared to be machine parts, neatly packed and labeled. Roger sifted through them, searching for anything out of the ordinary. His frustration grew. Was this all there was? Had he been wrong? As he dug deeper, his hand brushed against something cool and metallic. He pulled it out, a sleek, high-tech device with a logo he didn't recognize. It looked like some kind of prototype, but Roger couldn't discern its purpose. He took a photo of it before carefully placing it back in the crate. Before he could investigate further, a sound outside made him freeze. Footsteps. Someone was approaching the garage. Panic set in. Roger scrambled to replace the lid on the crate and slid behind a workbench, holding his breath as the footsteps grew louder. The door creaked open, and the neighbor stepped inside, humming to himself. Roger's heart hammered in his chest as he watched the man move about, seemingly unaware of his intruder. The neighbor fiddled with a toolbox, then moved to the crate, inspecting it briefly before turning toward the car. Roger seized the opportunity. As quietly as he could, he crept back toward the window, hoisted himself up, and slipped outside. He landed in the grass with a soft thud, his legs trembling with adrenaline. Without looking back, he sprinted across the yard and into his house, slamming the door behind him. Safe inside, Roger collapsed onto his couch, his mind racing. He had more questions than answers now, but one thing was certain. He was onto something. The device in the crate was unlike anything he'd ever seen, and he was determined to find out what it was. But as the adrenaline subsided, a new emotion crept in: fear. He crossed a line, and he knew it. If the neighbor discovered what he'd done, there would be consequences. Still, Roger convinced himself it was worth the risk. After all, the truth was out there, and he was the only one brave enough to uncover it. Roger's obsession with exposing the neighbor's secrets reached a breaking point after his late-night escapade in the garage. He couldn't let the mystery rest, not after the strange device he had uncovered. Every moment he wasn't actively spying, He was poring over the blurry photo he had taken of the unknown prototype. His internet searches turned up nothing conclusive, no matches for the logo, no indications of what the device might be. The lack of information only deepened his paranoia. The next morning, Roger noticed something peculiar. The neighbor's house was unusually quiet. Typically, there would be some kind of movement. Cars pulling in and out, deliveries arriving, the faint sound of machinery humming in the garage. But today, the house seemed eerily still. Roger's eyes stayed glued to his window, watching and waiting for any signs of life. When nothing happened by mid-afternoon, Roger decided to take a riskier step. He would go to the neighbor's front door under the guise of a friendly neighborly visit. Surely, he reasoned, he could learn more by interacting directly with the man rather than hiding behind fences and binoculars. Grabbing a plate of cookies he had bought at the local bakery, an attempt to feign goodwill, Roger crossed the street with a determined stride. As he approached the door, Roger rehearsed his lines in his head. He would compliment the neighbor's lawn, make small talk, and perhaps subtly inquire about the mysterious deliveries. He rang the doorbell and waited. His stomach churned as he heard footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened, revealing the neighbor standing there, his expression unreadable. Up close, the man appeared even more composed than Roger had anticipated. His demeanor radiated a quiet confidence that unsettled Roger. "Roger, isn't it?" the neighbor said, his tone polite but devoid of warmth. Roger forced a smile, holding up the plate of cookies. "I thought I'd bring these over. Just a little something to say welcome to the neighborhood." The neighbor's lips curled into a faint smile, though his eyes betrayed no emotion. "That's very kind of you. Thank you." Roger hesitated, standing awkwardly on the doorstep. "So, how are you settling in? Everything going okay?" "Quite well, thank you," the neighbor replied. He stepped forward, taking the cookies from Roger. "I appreciate the gesture." There was a brief silence, during which Roger felt an almost oppressive tension in the air. He decided to push a little further. "I couldn't help but notice you've been getting a lot of deliveries lately. Must be working on something interesting." The neighbor's smile didn't waver, but there was a noticeable pause before he responded. "I have a few hobbies that keep me busy. Nothing too exciting." Roger nodded, pretending to be casual. "Hobbies are great. I've been meaning to pick up some myself." "What kind of projects are you into?" The neighbor's gaze hardened slightly, and Roger felt as though he were being scrutinized. "Just some tinkering here and there," the man said vaguely. "I like to keep to myself." It was a clear dismissal, but Roger wasn't ready to give up. "Tinkering, huh? Sounds fascinating. You know, I used to be pretty handy with tools myself. Maybe we could collaborate on something one day." The neighbor's polite facade cracked ever so slightly. "I'm sure you're very talented, Roger, but I prefer to work alone." Before Roger could say anything else, the neighbor stepped back and began to close the door. "Thanks again for the cookies," he said, his tone final. The door clicked shut, leaving Roger standing there, seething with frustration. As he walked back to his house, Roger's mind raced. The man was clearly hiding something. His evasiveness, his refusal to engage, it all pointed to guilt. Roger was more convinced than ever that he was onto something big. Back in his living room, Roger paced back and forth, trying to come up with his next move. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that whatever the neighbor was planning, it was nearing completion. He needed more evidence, something concrete that he could use to expose the truth. That evening, Roger decided to take another bold step. Under the cover of darkness, he ventured back into the neighbor's yard. This time, he was equipped with a small camera and a flashlight. His plan was to document everything he could and analyze the footage later. As he crept toward the garage, he noticed something odd. The side window he had used to enter before was now sealed shut. The neighbor must have discovered the breach and taken precautions. Roger cursed under his breath. He would have to find another way in. Circling the house, he spotted a small basement window that was slightly ajar. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. He squeezed through the narrow opening, landing awkwardly on the basement floor. The air was damp, and the faint smell of chemicals lingered in the space. Roger turned on his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with containers and tools. In the center of the room was a workbench, cluttered with various components. Roger approached it cautiously, his camera at the ready. As he examined the workbench, he noticed a series of blueprints pinned to the wall. They were detailed schematics, but Roger couldn't make sense of them. He snapped a few photos, his hands trembling with excitement. This was it. This was the evidence he needed. But just as he was about to leave, he heard a noise from upstairs. Footsteps. The neighbor was home. Panic surged through Roger as he scrambled to find a hiding spot. He ducked behind a stack of boxes, holding his breath as the footsteps grew louder. The basement door creaked open, and Roger could see the faint outline of the neighbor descending the stairs. The man carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. Roger's heart pounded as the neighbor moved closer, his light scanning the room. "Who's there?" the neighbor called out, his voice calm but commanding. Roger stayed silent, his mind racing. He couldn't let himself get caught. Not now, not when he was so close to the truth. He prayed the man wouldn't find him, that he would turn around and leave. But the neighbor didn't leave. He continued to search the room, his flashlight passing dangerously close to Roger's hiding spot. Each second felt like an eternity as Roger fought to keep his breathing quiet. Finally, the neighbor seemed to give up. He turned and headed back upstairs, closing the basement door behind him. Roger waited until he was certain the man was gone before making his escape. He climbed back through the window, his heart still racing, and hurried back to his house. Once inside, Roger collapsed onto his couch, clutching the camera tightly. He had taken a huge risk, but it had paid off. The photos he had captured would surely reveal the neighbor's secrets. He couldn't wait to analyze them. But as he looked at the camera, a chilling thought crossed his mind. The neighbor had been suspicious, and he had been thorough in his search. Had he noticed the open window? Did he know someone had been in his basement? For the first time, Roger felt a pang of fear. He had crossed a line, and he knew it. But it was too late to turn back now. The truth was within his grasp, and he was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. Roger barely slept that night, the adrenaline of his near discovery fueling his obsession. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow outside his window had him jumping out of bed to check his monitors. He couldn't shake the feeling that his neighbor had been aware of his intrusion but had chosen not to confront him directly. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating, proof that the man wasn't as oblivious as he pretended to be. As the morning light filtered through the blinds, Roger sifted through the photos on his camera. The blueprints he had captured were detailed but cryptic, filled with symbols and notes that he couldn't decipher. He stared at the schematics, his mind racing with possibilities. They looked technical, perhaps related to engineering or advanced technology, but nothing he could pinpoint. The mystery gnawed at him. He decided he needed help. As much as he hated to involve someone else, he couldn't make sense of the evidence on his own. After some deliberation, he reached out to an old acquaintance from college, Brian, who had a background in engineering. Their relationship had faded over the years, but Roger knew Brian's curiosity would be piqued by the intrigue of the situation. Roger texted Brian, keeping his message vague. "Need your expertise on something. Blueprints I came across could be important. Can we meet?" Brian's reply was quick. "Send them over. I'll take a look." Roger hesitated. He didn't want to risk sharing the images digitally in case they were intercepted. He needed to control the narrative. Better in person. "Meet me at the diner near 5th Street this afternoon." Brian agreed, albeit reluctantly, and Roger felt a flicker of hope. Finally, he might gain some clarity. At the diner, Roger arrived early, nervously drumming his fingers on the table as he waited for Brian. When his friend arrived, his casual demeanor was a stark contrast to Roger's anxious energy. Brian slid into the booth, giving Roger a curious look. "This better be worth it," Brian said, signaling for a cup of coffee. Roger slid the photos across the table, lowering his voice. "Take a look at these. Tell me what you think." Brian picked up the images, his brow furrowing as he examined them. "Where'd you get these?" Doesn't matter, Roger replied quickly. Just focus on what they mean. Brian studied the schematics for several minutes, his expression growing more serious. These are definitely advanced. Looks like some kind of prototype, could be machinery, robotics, maybe even energy related. Hard to say without more context. Could they be dangerous? Roger asked, leaning forward. Brian shrugged. Potentially, but anything could be dangerous in the wrong hands. Why are you asking? Are you involved in something sketchy? Roger hesitated. Let's just say I have reasons to believe these belong to someone who's not on the level. Brian raised an eyebrow. You're not making sense, man. If you think these are tied to something illegal, why not just go to the authorities? I can't do that, Roger snapped. Not yet. I need more proof. Brian sighed, sliding the photos back across the table. Look, these are interesting, but without context, they don't mean much. If you're so convinced there's something going on, why not confront whoever owns them? Roger gritted his teeth. It's not that simple. Brian gave him a long, scrutinizing look before standing up. You're getting yourself worked up over something you don't even understand. Be careful, Roger. Obsession can ruin you. As Brian walked away, Roger felt a mix of frustration and determination. He was on his own again, but he couldn't let that stop him. If anything, Brian's vague insights had confirmed his suspicions. The blueprints were significant, and they pointed to something much larger than a simple garage project. Back at home, Roger resumed his surveillance with renewed vigor. That afternoon, he noticed something unusual. A second car pulling into the neighbor's driveway. It was an older model, nondescript but well-maintained. A man stepped out, wearing a plain suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Roger's heart raced as he grabbed his binoculars. The interaction between the two men was brief but formal. They exchanged a few words, and the neighbor gestured toward the garage. The suited man nodded and followed him inside. Roger watched intently, his mind racing with possibilities. Was this a business meeting? A handoff? He needed to know what was happening behind those closed doors. Determined to uncover more, Roger decided to take another risk. He would follow the visitor after he left, hoping to learn more about his connection to the neighbor. As soon as the suited man emerged from the garage, Roger slipped out the back door and climbed into his car, parking a few houses down to avoid suspicion. The man's car pulled onto the main road, and Roger followed at a safe distance. His hands gripped the wheel tightly as he navigated through the suburban streets and onto the highway. The drive stretched on for nearly an hour, leading Roger into a bustling city center. Finally, the car pulled into an underground parking garage beneath an office building. Roger parked nearby, his adrenaline spiking as he watched the man exit the vehicle and enter the building. He debated whether to follow but decided against it. He couldn't risk being spotted. Instead, he wrote down the address and snapped a photo of the building, making a mental note to investigate further. Back home, Roger's wife finally confronted him. She had been patient until now, but his erratic behavior and late nights had pushed her to the edge. Roger, we need to talk, she said, her tone firm. Not now, Roger replied, brushing past her toward his study. Yes, now, she insisted, blocking his path. I've had enough of this. You've been completely consumed by whatever this is, and it's tearing us apart. Roger sighed, running a hand through his hair. You don't understand. I'm close to figuring it out. Figuring what out? She demanded. Some ridiculous conspiracy theory about our neighbor? You've isolated yourself from everyone, even me, because of this obsession. It's not healthy. I'm doing this for us, Roger said defensively. For the neighborhood. No, you're doing this for yourself, she shot back. You're so focused on proving you're right that you've lost sight of everything else. Her words stung, but Roger refused to back down. You'll see. When the truth comes out, you'll understand. She shook her head, tears in her eyes. I don't know if I can wait that long. With that, she walked away, leaving Roger alone with his thoughts. Her departure only fueled his resolve. He couldn't afford to stop now. Not when he was so close. He had to see this through, no matter the cost. Roger sat in his study, his hands trembling as he sifted through his notes. His wife's words lingered in his mind. a sharp reminder of how far he had spiraled. Yet, instead of reevaluating his actions, he felt an even stronger need to justify them. If he could uncover the truth about his neighbor, it would validate everything. He couldn't stop now, not when he was so close. The next morning, Roger noticed another strange occurrence. The garage door was open, and inside, his neighbor was working on something large and metallic. It was the first time Roger had seen the project so openly displayed. His neighbor seemed completely at ease, tinkering away with tools while whistling a tune. The audacity of it infuriated Roger. He saw it as a deliberate act, as if the man was taunting him. Roger grabbed his binoculars, focusing on the machine. It appeared to be some kind of vehicle, though not like any car Roger had ever seen. The sleek, futuristic design was both fascinating and unsettling. Was this what all the deliveries had been for? Was this the key to the neighbor's secret? Unable to contain his curiosity, Roger decided to approach the garage under the pretense of casual conversation. He rehearsed his lines as he crossed the street, doing his best to appear calm and nonchalant. When he reached the driveway, he called out, "Morning. Looks like you're working on something interesting." The neighbor glanced up, his expression neutral. "Morning, Roger. Just a little project to keep me busy." Roger walked closer, his eyes fixed on the machine. "That's quite the project. Mind if I take a look?" The neighbor hesitated, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's not much to see right now. Still a work in progress." Roger forced a laugh. "Come on, don't be modest. Something like this must take a lot of skill and resources." The neighbor's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone remained friendly. "It's just a hobby. Nothing more." Roger gestured toward the machine. "Looks more like something out of a sci-fi movie. What's it for?" The neighbor smiled faintly, but there was a hint of irritation in his voice. "Just a personal project. Like I said, nothing exciting." Roger could feel the tension building. The man's evasiveness only fueled his suspicions. "You know, you're quite the mystery around here," Roger said, his tone casual but probing. "People are starting to wonder what you're really up to." The neighbor's smile faded, and for the first time, Roger saw a flicker of annoyance. "I don't think my hobbies are anyone's business, Roger." Roger held up his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, I'm just trying to be neighborly. No harm in a little curiosity." The neighbor didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to his work, effectively ending the conversation. Roger stood there for a moment, feeling both dismissed and emboldened. He had struck a nerve, and he intended to keep pushing. Later that day, Roger noticed a delivery van pulling into the neighbor's driveway. This time, two men stepped out, each carrying a heavy-looking case. They exchanged a few words with the neighbor before unloading the cases into the garage. Roger watched intently, his mind racing with theories. What could be in those cases? Tools? Materials? Something more sinister? Determined to find out, Roger decided to stake out the garage that night. He waited until the neighborhood was quiet, then slipped into his backyard and positioned himself behind a row of bushes with a clear view of the garage. Armed with his binoculars and a notebook, he prepared for a long night of observation. Hours passed, and the garage lights remained on. Roger could see the neighbor moving back and forth, occasionally stopping to inspect the machine. At one point, the man stepped outside, looking up at the sky as if deep in thought. Roger held his breath, worried he might be spotted, but the neighbor eventually went back inside. As the night wore on, Roger's mind began to wander. He thought about his wife, about Jack's warnings, about the life he had neglected in his pursuit of answers. But even those thoughts couldn't shake his resolve. He had come too far to stop now. Around midnight, something unexpected happened. A black SUV pulled into the driveway, and three men in suits stepped out. Roger's pulse quickened as he watched the men enter the garage. Their presence added a new layer of intrigue. Who were they? Business partners? Associates? Enforcers? Roger strained to hear the conversation, but the distance made it impossible. He considered creeping closer but decided against it. The risk of being caught was too high. Instead, he focused on documenting every detail: the license plate of the SUV, the appearance of the men, the way they carried themselves. After about an hour, the men emerged from the garage, their expressions serious. One of them was carrying a folder, which he handed to the neighbor before getting back into the SUV. The vehicle drove off, leaving Roger with more questions than answers. Back inside his house, Roger pored over his notes, trying to piece everything together. The machine, the blueprints, the mysterious visitors, it all pointed to something significant. But what? He felt like he was on the verge of a breakthrough, yet the answers remained just out of reach. The following day, Roger noticed a change in the neighborhood. People were acting differently around him, avoiding eye contact, crossing the street to avoid passing by his house. Even Jack seemed distant, offering only a curt nod when they crossed paths. Roger couldn't understand it. Had word spread about his obsession? Were people starting to turn against him? That evening, Roger's wife confronted him again. This time, she was visibly upset. "Roger, this has to stop. You're scaring people." "Scaring people?" Roger echoed, incredulous. "I'm the only one trying to protect this neighborhood." "No, you're the one terrorizing it," she shot back. "Everyone's talking about your behavior, how you're spying on the neighbor, how you've been sneaking around at night. It's not normal, Roger." Roger's temper flared. "They don't understand. You don't understand. This man is hiding something, and I'm the only one willing to do something about it." His wife's voice softened, but her expression was firm. "You're losing yourself, Roger. Please, just let it go before it's too late." But Roger couldn't let it go. He was too far in, too consumed by his need for answers. As his wife walked away, he turned back to his monitors, determined to uncover the truth no matter the cost. The lines between reality and paranoia blurred further, and Roger had no intention of stepping back. He was convinced that he was the hero in this story, even as the world around him began to crumble. Roger's obsession consumed him entirely. His days revolved around watching, waiting, and speculating, and his nights were filled with restless pacing and wild theorizing. His wife had stopped speaking to him altogether, retreating to the guest room with a suitcase packed, a silent warning he refused to acknowledge. Jack had stopped answering his calls, and the once friendly faces in the neighborhood now turned away when they saw him coming. But Roger didn't care. None of it mattered compared to the truth he was determined to uncover. The mysterious visitors, the blueprints, the cryptic behavior. It all added up to something monumental, and Roger was convinced he was the only one who could stop it. The day started like any other, with Roger glued to his monitors. He noted every move his neighbor made, jotting down details in his ever-expanding notebook. But by mid-morning, something unusual happened. A convoy of vehicles pulled into the street, led by a sleek black SUV. Behind it were two white vans with tinted windows, their presence ominous. Roger's pulse quickened as he watched the vehicles park in front of the neighbor's house. Men in dark suits emerged, their movements brisk and purposeful. They carried equipment cases into the house, each one marked with labels Roger couldn't decipher. The neighbor greeted them at the door, his demeanor calm but focused. Roger grabbed his binoculars, struggling to make out the interactions. The men seemed professional, almost military in their precision. They moved with practiced efficiency, unloading case after case and disappearing into the house. Roger strained to see inside, but the angle was too steep. Frustrated, he turned his attention to the driveway, noting the license plates of the vehicles. This was bigger than anything he had seen before. The scale of the operation confirmed his suspicions. His neighbor wasn't just an eccentric hobbyist. He was involved in something far-reaching, something that demanded secrecy and coordination. Roger felt vindicated but also increasingly paranoid. What if they discovered his surveillance? What if they came for him next? By the afternoon, the convoy was gone, leaving Roger with more questions than answers. He spent hours replaying the footage from his cameras, analyzing every detail. The labels on the cases, the demeanor of the men, the equipment they carried. Everything seemed significant, but nothing gave him the definitive proof he needed. Desperate for answers, Roger decided to escalate his investigation. He called Brian again, this time refusing to take no for an answer. "Brian, this is serious," Roger said, his voice frantic. "You saw the blueprints. You know something's off here." Brian sighed on the other end of the line. "Roger, I told you before, without context, those blueprints don't mean anything. You're chasing shadows. Then help me find the context." Roger snapped. "This isn't just paranoia. Something big is happening, and I need your expertise." There was a long pause before Brian finally relented. "Fine, I'll come by tomorrow, but this is the last time. If I don't find anything conclusive, you need to let this go." Roger agreed, though he had no intention of stopping. Brian's involvement was just another piece of the puzzle, another step toward uncovering the truth. The next morning, Brian arrived with a laptop and a skeptical expression. Roger ushered him into the study, where the walls were covered with photos, notes, and printed screenshots from the surveillance cameras. It was a chaotic collage of Roger's obsession, and Brian's eyes widened as he took it all in. "Wow," Brian said, setting his laptop on the desk. "You've really gone all in, haven't you?" Roger ignored the comment, pointing to the photos of the blueprints. "Start with these. Figure out what they're for." Brian sighed but complied, scanning the images into his laptop and running searches for similar designs. Meanwhile, Roger paced the room, his nerves fraying as he waited for results. After nearly an hour, Brian looked up, his expression serious. "Okay, I've got something. These designs, they're not just random. They're part of a modular system, likely for some kind of advanced vehicle or machinery. The components are high-tech, probably custom-made." Roger's heart raced. "I knew it. What kind of vehicle? Military? Industrial?" Brian shook his head. "Hard to say without more data. But whatever it is, it's sophisticated. Definitely not your average DIY project." Roger felt a surge of vindication. "This is it. This is the proof I needed." Brian frowned. "Proof of what exactly? That your neighbor is working on something advanced? That's not illegal, Roger." "You don't get it," Roger said, his voice rising. "This isn't just some harmless project. He's hiding something, and it's my job to expose it." Brian closed his laptop, his patience wearing thin. "Look, I've given you all I can. If you want my advice, drop this before it spirals out of control." Roger glared at him. "It's already out of control, and I'm not stopping until I get to the bottom of it." Brian sighed and left, leaving Roger alone with his mounting paranoia. The walls of his study seemed to close in on him as he stared at the photos and notes, the evidence of his obsession. He was running out of allies, out of time, but he refused to back down. That evening, Roger noticed another strange occurrence. The garage lights were on again, but this time, the neighbor wasn't alone. A group of people had gathered inside, their voices carrying faintly through the night air. Roger adjusted his binoculars, trying to make out the scene. The group seemed to be inspecting the large metallic machine, their gestures animated as they discussed something. Roger's curiosity burned, but his fear held him back. He knew he couldn't risk another break-in, not with so many people present. Instead, he focused on documenting everything, snapping photos and jotting down details in his notebook. As the hours passed, the group dispersed, leaving the neighbor alone in the garage. Roger watched as the man tinkered with the machine, his movements deliberate and methodical. Whatever he was working on, it was nearing completion. Roger's mind raced with possibilities. Was it a weapon? A vehicle? A prototype for something revolutionary? He felt like he was standing on the edge of a revelation, but the answers remained tantalizingly out of reach. By the time dawn broke, Roger was exhausted but resolute. He was closer than ever to uncovering the truth, and he wouldn't stop until he did. The stakes were higher than ever, and Roger was willing to risk everything to expose the secrets hidden behind his neighbor's calm facade. Roger's obsession was no longer just an internal battle. It was spilling into every aspect of his life. His wife had moved out temporarily, leaving a note on the fridge that read, "I'll be back when you're yourself again." The neighborhood had grown colder toward him, whispers and side eyes greeting him whenever he stepped outside. But none of it mattered to Roger. He saw himself as a lone crusader in a sea of ignorance. He couldn't afford to stop now, not when he was so close. The morning brought another delivery to the neighbor's house, this time a single black van with no markings. The driver unloaded several compact crates and handed a clipboard to the neighbor, who signed without hesitation. The exchange was quick and efficient, the crates disappearing into the garage within minutes. Roger watched through his binoculars, noting every detail. The crates were uniform in size and design, with no identifying labels. Whatever was inside, it was important enough to arrive in an unmarked vehicle, shrouded in secrecy. Roger's frustration mounted. He had pieces of the puzzle, but they didn't fit together, not yet. Deciding he needed a closer look, Roger devised a plan. He would feign concern over a neighborhood issue to strike up a conversation with his neighbor. Perhaps he could glean some new information by catching the man off guard. Grabbing a clipboard of his own, Roger jotted down a list of fabricated complaints about noise levels and late-night activity. When he knocked on the neighbor's door, the man answered quickly, his expression neutral but slightly wary. "Roger, what can I do for you?" Roger held up the clipboard, forcing a polite smile. "Good morning. Just wanted to touch base about some concerns a few of us in the neighborhood have been discussing." The neighbor raised an eyebrow. "Concerns?" "Yes," Roger said, his tone measured. "There's been a lot of activity at your place lately. Deliveries, late-night work. It's raised some questions about whether it might be disruptive." The neighbor's gaze didn't waver, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. "I wasn't aware it was an issue," Roger pressed on. "It's not just about noise, you see. People are wondering what's going on. Transparency goes a long way toward keeping the peace." The neighbor's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I appreciate the feedback, Roger, but I assure you, everything I'm doing is perfectly above board." "Of course," Roger said quickly, sensing an opportunity. "But wouldn't it put everyone at ease if they knew a little more? Just to clear the air." The neighbor chuckled softly, the sound carrying an edge of condescension. "I think you're overestimating how much people care. Most of them have better things to do than speculate about their neighbors' hobbies." Roger bristled at the dismissal. With all due respect, it's hard not to notice when someone's activities seem unusual. The neighbor's smile faded entirely, and his tone grew firmer. "Roger, let me be clear. I'm not obligated to explain myself to you or anyone else. I respect your privacy, and I expect the same in return." Before Roger could respond, the neighbor stepped back and closed the door, leaving him standing on the porch, seething. The man's calm arrogance only fueled Roger's determination. He wasn't just going to expose the truth. He was going to make sure the entire neighborhood saw what this man was hiding. Back in his study, Roger pored over his notes, trying to make sense of the latest developments. He examined the photos he had taken, scrutinizing every detail of the black van and the crates. His searches turned up nothing concrete, but he refused to give up. The secrecy surrounding the deliveries was proof enough that something was amiss. That evening, Roger decided to escalate further. He donned dark clothing and waited until the neighborhood was quiet before venturing into the neighbor's yard. This time, he avoided the garage and focused on the house itself. He crept along the side, peering into windows and taking photos of anything that seemed out of place. Through one window, Roger spotted a room filled with monitors and equipment. The setup was far more advanced than he had anticipated, with multiple screens displaying what appeared to be live feeds and data readouts. Roger's pulse quickened. What was the neighbor monitoring? Who else might be involved? As he adjusted his angle to get a better view, he accidentally brushed against a potted plant, knocking it over with a faint crash. He froze, his heart pounding. Moments later, a light flicked on inside the house, and he heard footsteps approaching. Panicking, Roger ducked behind a bush, holding his breath as the footsteps drew nearer. The neighbor appeared at the window, his eyes scanning the yard. Roger remained perfectly still, praying the darkness would conceal him. After a tense moment, The neighbor seemed to dismiss the noise and turned off the light, retreating into the house. Roger waited several minutes before making his escape, his adrenaline surging as he slipped back into his own yard. Once inside, he reviewed the photos he had taken, though they were blurry and inconclusive. Still, the sight of the equipment room had confirmed his suspicions. The neighbor was involved in something far beyond the realm of ordinary hobbies. The following day, Roger noticed another change in the neighborhood. A small group of residents had gathered on the sidewalk near his house, speaking in hushed tones. When Roger approached, they fell silent, their expressions a mix of pity and unease. "What's going on?" Roger asked, feigning ignorance. One of the neighbors, an older woman named Marge, hesitated before responding. "Roger, people are worried about you." "Worried?" Roger repeated, his voice sharp. "Why?" Marge glanced at the others before continuing. "We've seen you watching, sneaking around. It's not healthy, Roger. Maybe you should take a step back." Roger's temper flared. "Step back? While that man gets away with who knows what. You should be thanking me for keeping an eye on things." Marge sighed. "Roger, maybe it's time to let it go. You've done enough." But Roger wouldn't hear it. He stormed back into his house, slamming the door behind him. The neighborhood's lack of support only strengthened his resolve. He couldn't count on anyone else to see this through. He was on his own, but that was fine. He didn't need their approval. As night fell, Roger returned to his surveillance post, his eyes fixed on the neighbor's house. The garage lights were on again, and the neighbor was working late into the night. Roger watched intently, noting every movement, every detail. He felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align, the truth just within reach. But as the hours stretched on, Roger couldn't shake the feeling that the neighbor was aware of his presence. The man's movements seemed deliberate, calculated, as if he were putting on a show. Roger's paranoia deepened, but he refused to back down. He would find the truth no matter what it took. Roger's resolve was unshakable now, but so was the tension building between him and his increasingly aware neighbor. The day after his midnight reconnaissance, Roger noticed something unsettling. The neighbor seemed to be taking precautions. New security cameras had been installed around the perimeter of the house, their lenses gleaming in the sunlight as if they were staring directly at Roger's house. It was as though the man was taunting him, daring Roger to make another move. Roger didn't see this as a deterrent. He saw it as confirmation. The neighbor knew someone was onto him, and these measures were an attempt to cover his tracks. Roger scribbled furiously in his notebook, documenting every new camera and its angle. He was already formulating a plan to bypass them. Later that morning, Roger's paranoia deepened when he saw the neighbor loading several boxes into the trunk of his car. The man moved with purpose, glancing over his shoulder occasionally as if checking to see if he was being watched. Roger crouched by his window, binoculars trained on the scene. He noted the dimensions of the boxes, their nondescript brown exteriors, and the faint writing on the side that he couldn't quite make out. When the car pulled out of the driveway, Roger grabbed his keys and hurried to his own car. He knew he was taking a risk, but he couldn't let the neighbor's movements go unmonitored. Keeping a safe distance, Roger followed the car through the neighborhood and onto the highway. His heart raced as he tried to maintain his cover, staying far enough back to avoid suspicion. The drive was tense, but uneventful until they reached the outskirts of town. The neighbor's car turned into a gated facility surrounded by high fences and barbed wire. Roger pulled over a safe distance away, his curiosity piqued. The gate had a keypad, and the neighbor punched in a code before driving inside. Roger strained to see what was beyond the gate but couldn't make out much from his position. This wasn't an ordinary destination, and Roger was certain it had something to do with the neighbor's secret. He jotted down the address and took a few photos of the gate before heading back home. His mind was a whirlwind of theories. What kind of place required such high security? Was it a lab, a government facility, or something even more clandestine? Back at his house, Roger couldn't focus on anything else. He tried searching for the facility online but came up with nothing. It was as if the place didn't exist. Frustrated but undeterred, he decided to confront his neighbor again, this time directly. Roger waited until the evening, when the neighbor returned. The man's car pulled into the driveway, and he unloaded the empty boxes with an air of nonchalance that infuriated Roger. It was as though he knew Roger was watching but didn't care. Roger stormed across the street, his fists clenched. He didn't bother knocking this time. He called out from the driveway, "Hey, we need to talk." The neighbor turned, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Roger, what's this about?" Roger didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know you're hiding something. All these deliveries, the equipment, that facility you went to today, what are you up to?" The neighbor's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Amusement? Maybe? "Roger, I think you're letting your imagination get the better of you." "Don't patronize me," Roger snapped. "I've seen the blueprints. I know about the visitors. You're involved in something, and I'm not the only one who's noticed." The neighbor tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Roger, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I assure you, everything I'm doing is completely legal." "That's not good enough," Roger said, his voice rising. "You owe this neighborhood an explanation. People are talking and they're worried." The neighbor took a step closer, his voice lowering but carrying a firm edge. "Roger, I've tried to be patient with you. I've ignored your spying, your late-night visits, your constant meddling. But this is crossing the line. My personal affairs are none of your business." Roger refused to back down. "You're making them everyone's business with your secrecy. If you have nothing to hide, prove it. Show me what you're working on." The neighbor's expression hardened. "I don't owe you, or anyone else, an explanation. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." He turned and walked into the house, closing the door firmly behind him. Roger stood there for a moment, seething with anger. The man's arrogance was infuriating. He thought he could just dismiss Roger like that? Not a chance. Determined to escalate, Roger decided to involve the rest of the neighborhood. That night, he went door to door, sharing his concerns and rallying support. Some neighbors listened politely, nodding along but offering no commitment. Others outright dismissed him, clearly uncomfortable with his intensity. Marge, the older woman who had confronted him before, sighed as he explained his suspicions. "Roger, I understand you're worried, but this is starting to feel unhealthy. You need to take a step back." "I don't need to take a step back," Roger snapped. "I need people to wake up and see what's happening right under their noses." Marge gave him a pitying look. "Maybe it's time to let someone else handle it. The authorities, maybe." Roger scoffed. "The authorities? They'd laugh me out of the station without proof." "Then maybe that's your answer," Marge said gently. "If you don't have proof, maybe there's nothing to worry about." Roger left her house in a huff, more determined than ever. He didn't need the neighborhood's support. He didn't need anyone. He would uncover the truth himself, even if it meant risking everything. As the night wore on, Roger's paranoia reached new heights. He was certain the neighbor knew he was onto him, and he was equally certain the man was planning something to silence him. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside his window felt like a threat. He spent the night reviewing his notes and photos, looking for patterns he might have missed. The blueprints, the equipment, the facility, they were all connected somehow, but he couldn't see how. The pieces didn't fit, and it was driving him mad. By the time dawn broke, Roger was exhausted but no less determined. He stared out his window at the neighbor's house, his mind racing with possibilities. Whatever the man was hiding, it wouldn't stay hidden for long. Roger would make sure of that. And when the truth came out, the entire neighborhood would finally see him for what he was, a hero. Roger's frustration had reached its boiling point. Every attempt to unmask his neighbor had been met with resistance, ridicule, or outright dismissal. His obsession was now a full-blown vendetta, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to get answers. The neighbor's arrogance, his cryptic activities, the constant secrets, they all screamed of wrongdoing, and Roger was done playing nice. That morning, Roger noticed something unusual. A sleek, black limousine pulled into the neighbor's driveway, its windows tinted to the point of near opacity. Roger's binoculars trembled in his hands as he watched the driver step out and open the rear door. A tall figure emerged, dressed sharply but with an air of casual authority that caught Roger's attention immediately. The man exuded a quiet power, his every move deliberate and confident. Roger couldn't make out his face from the distance, but the sight of him sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through his veins. Who was this new player? Another partner? A higher-up in whatever shadowy organization his neighbor was part of? Roger didn't wait to find out. He grabbed his notebook, camera, and a set of earpieces he had purchased for just this sort of situation. He planned to get close enough to eavesdrop, no matter the risk. As the stranger entered the house, Roger crept around the perimeter of the neighbor's property, his heart pounding in his chest. He found a spot beneath a partially open window, crouching low to stay out of sight. From inside, he could hear muffled voices, their tones measured but intense. "On schedule," the stranger was saying, his voice deep and commanding. "We can't afford delays." "I understand," the neighbor replied, his tone deferential but firm. "Everything is proceeding as planned." Roger strained to hear more but couldn't make out the details. He adjusted his position, inadvertently causing a twig to snap beneath his foot. He froze, his breath catching in his throat as the conversation inside abruptly stopped. Moments later, the neighbor appeared at the window, his sharp eyes scanning the yard. Roger ducked lower, praying the man wouldn't spot him. After a tense moment, the neighbor seemed satisfied and retreated inside. Roger exhaled shakily, his mind racing. He needed to know more, needed to see who this new figure was and what role he played. Fueled by desperation, Roger decided to wait until the stranger left and follow him, no matter where it led. Hours passed before the limousine finally pulled out of the driveway. Roger scrambled into his car and tailed it, keeping a safe distance. The drive took them out of the suburbs and into the city, winding through busy streets until they arrived at an imposing skyscraper. The stranger exited the car and disappeared into the building, leaving Roger to stew in his frustration. He parked nearby and waited, his eyes fixed on the entrance. Eventually, the stranger reappeared, flanked by a small entourage. They entered a conference room visible through the building's glass facade, and Roger finally got a clear view of the man's face. His heart nearly stopped. It was Elon Musk. Roger stared in disbelief, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The man he had been obsessing over, the neighbor he had been surveilling for weeks, wasn't just some secretive eccentric. He was someone with direct ties to one of the most influential people on the planet. And now, Elon Musk was here, involved in whatever his neighbor had been working on. The revelation hit Roger like a freight train. His neighbor wasn't the villain he had imagined. He was part of something far bigger, something that made Roger's petty suspicions seem laughable in comparison. The blueprints, the equipment, the mysterious visitors, it all made sense now. His neighbor wasn't hiding something malicious. He was collaborating with one of the greatest innovators of the modern age. But instead of feeling vindicated, Roger felt humiliated. His obsession had led him to this moment, and all it had done was reveal how little he truly understood. The neighborhood wasn't under threat. It was part of a groundbreaking project, one that could change the world. Still, Roger's pride wouldn't let him back down. He decided to confront the neighbor one last time, armed with the knowledge of Elon Musk's involvement. He stormed back to the house, his anger fueled by a mix of embarrassment and defiance. He knocked on the door, louder than necessary, and waited. The neighbor answered, his expression calm but guarded. "Roger, what now?" Roger didn't waste time. "I know who you're working with." The neighbor raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" "Elon Musk," Roger said, the name practically a challenge. "I saw him at the skyscraper. I know he's involved in whatever you're doing." The neighbor's lips twitched, as if suppressing a smile. "And what exactly do you think I'm doing, Roger?" Roger faltered, his bravado wavering. Something big. Something you've been hiding from everyone." The neighbor stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "Roger, I don't owe you an explanation. But since you're so determined to uncover the truth, let me make one thing clear. Nothing I'm doing is a threat to this neighborhood. Quite the opposite, in fact. Roger scoffed. You expect me to believe that? I don't care what you believe, the neighbor said evenly. But maybe it's time you looked at the bigger picture. Not everything is a conspiracy, Roger. Sometimes, people are just trying to make the world a better place. The words stung more than Roger cared to admit. He wanted to argue, to push back, but the weight of the revelation left him speechless. For weeks, he had painted himself as a hero, the lone voice of reason in a world of ignorance. But now, he realized he had been nothing more than a fool, tilting at windmills. The neighbor regarded him for a moment longer before turning and walking back inside, leaving Roger to stand there, his mind reeling. For the first time, he felt the full weight of his actions, the damage he had caused, the relationships he had strained, the trust he had broken. And for what? A crusade that had led nowhere. As he walked back to his house, Roger couldn't shake the feeling that he had been the antagonist all along. He had set out to expose a villain, only to become one himself. And now, he was left to pick up the pieces of a life he had nearly destroyed. Roger stood on his porch, staring at the neighbor's house. For weeks, it had been the epicenter of his obsession, the source of his sleepless nights, and the focus of his crumbling relationships. But now, it stood as a silent monument to the truth he had been too blinded by paranoia to see. His neighbor wasn't a villain, he was a visionary. And the man he had been spying on was none other than Elon Musk, one of the most influential minds in the world. As if on cue, the garage door across the street began to open. Roger's pulse quickened, though this time it wasn't from anger or suspicion. It was from dread. He had spent so much time vilifying his neighbor, accusing him of heinous intentions, that he wasn't sure how he could ever face the man again. But something in him, perhaps guilt or pride, pushed him to cross the street. When he reached the driveway, he found his neighbor and Elon Musk standing together, their focus on the sleek, futuristic vehicle that Roger had been obsessing over. The machine gleamed under the sunlight, its design so advanced it looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. The sight was both awe-inspiring and humbling. The neighbor was the first to notice him. "Roger," he said, his tone neutral but carrying a hint of wariness. "What brings you here?" Roger cleared his throat, his hands trembling. I just wanted to apologize." Both men turned to him, their expressions unreadable. Elon Musk's presence was almost surreal. He didn't speak, but his piercing gaze seemed to weigh Roger's every word. "I was wrong," Roger continued, his voice cracking. "I let my imagination get the better of me. I accused you of things that weren't true. I spied on you, spread rumors. And I'm sorry." The neighbor folded his arms, his face still impassive. "Why the change of heart?" Roger gestured weakly toward the vehicle. I saw the limousine, followed it. I saw you, Mr. Musk, at that building. I realized I'd been making assumptions this whole time." Elon Musk finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "And what did you assume?" Roger hesitated, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. "I thought you were hiding something dangerous, that you were a threat to the neighborhood." Musk raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "A threat? That's a first." The neighbor smirked but didn't say anything, allowing Musk to continue. "Roger, people fear what they don't understand. It's a natural response. But instead of seeking answers, you created a narrative that fit your fears. That's the real danger." Roger's shoulders sagged under the weight of Musk's words. "I see that now. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. To both of you." The neighbor exchanged a glance with Musk, then stepped forward. "Apologies are a start, Roger. But trust takes time to rebuild." "I understand," Roger said quickly. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Musk's gaze softened slightly. "Do you know what we've been working on?" Roger shook his head. "Not really. I saw the blueprints, the deliveries, the equipment. You thought the worst," Musk finished for him. He gestured to the vehicle. This is a prototype for an electric rescue vehicle, fully autonomous, equipped for disaster zones, and powered by renewable energy. We're working to deploy these globally to places where human responders can't reach safely. Roger's jaw dropped. He had spent weeks vilifying a project designed to save lives. I had no idea. That's the point, the neighbor said. It wasn't your idea to know. Some things require confidentiality during development, especially when they involve cutting-edge technology. Musk nodded. And when people make assumptions, it can jeopardize not only the project but the trust we build with communities. Roger felt the sting of those words. His actions had been a betrayal of that trust, not just with his neighbor but with the entire community. I don't know how to make up for what I've done. The neighbor sighed, his tone softening. Start by being honest with yourself and with others. Fear and curiosity are fine, but they shouldn't drive you to hurt people. Musk stepped closer, his demeanor less stern now. People like you, Roger, have the potential to be allies instead of adversaries. You clearly care about your community. Use that energy to build bridges, not burn them. Roger nodded, tears welling in his eyes. I will. Promise. The sound of footsteps interrupted them. A small group of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the sight of Musk and the futuristic vehicle. Among them was Jack, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. What's going on? Jack asked, his gaze shifting between Roger and the two men. Roger took a deep breath and turned to face the group. I owe all of you an apology. I let my fears get the better of me, and I spread lies about my neighbor. None of it was true. Marge stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. So you're admitting you were wrong? Roger nodded. Completely. I wasted weeks chasing shadows, and all I did was hurt people. But I'm done with that. I'm going to make things right. The neighbors exchanged glances, their expressions softening slightly. Jack gave Roger a small nod of approval. It takes guts to admit you were wrong. Musk stepped forward, addressing the group. What Roger saw as secrecy was actually caution. Projects like these require discretion, but they're always for the greater good. I hope this clears up any concerns. The neighbors murmured their agreement, their tension easing. The focus shifted to the vehicle, with Musk explaining its capabilities and purpose. Roger stepped back, letting the moment unfold. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. He had been wrong, deeply, embarrassingly wrong, but he was determined to learn from his mistakes. As the crowd dispersed, the neighbor approached Roger. You've got a long road ahead if you want to rebuild trust. I know, Roger said, but I'm willing to do the work. The neighbor gave a small nod. Good. And maybe next time, start by asking questions instead of making accusations. Roger smiled weakly. Lesson learned. Musk extended a hand to Roger, who shook it hesitantly. Remember, Roger, curiosity is a gift, but it needs to be tempered with understanding. Use it wisely. Roger nodded, the weight of Musk's words settling over him. As he walked back to his house, he felt a glimmer of hope. He couldn't undo the past, but he could shape the future. And for the first time in weeks, he felt ready to try. What a journey, right? Roger's story is a powerful reminder for all of us about the dangers of jumping to conclusions and letting fear dictate our actions. How often do we judge a situation or a person without having all the facts? It's a trap that's so easy to fall into, especially when curiosity turns into suspicion. But here's the thing, curiosity isn't the enemy. It's how we use it that matters. When it's paired with understanding and empathy, it can lead to incredible discoveries and connections. But when it's driven by fear or prejudice, it can cause unnecessary harm, just like we saw with Roger. Elon Musk's involvement was the ultimate twist, but it's also a testament to the fact that sometimes what we think is a threat is actually an opportunity in disguise. Imagine if Roger had approached the situation with an open mind from the beginning. He could have been part of something extraordinary instead of tearing it down. This story leaves us with an important question. How do we handle the unknown? Do we approach it with curiosity and respect, or do we let our assumptions and insecurities take over? Let us know in the comments how you've overcome situations where jumping to conclusions almost cost you, and what you learned from it. And remember, the world is full of possibilities, but it's up to us to see them clearly. If the story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs this reminder today. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories that inspire, challenge, and maybe even surprise you. Until next time, stay curious and stay kind.